There is a particular kind of suffering that lives beneath the surface of modern relationships, invisible to most men until it has already carved out something essential from inside them. It manifests first as a vague, uneasy tightness in the chest when his phone lights up with her name, a micro-hesitation before he speaks his mind, a strange rehearsal of words in his head before sending a simple text. He tells himself this is care. He tells himself this is what it means to be considerate, emotionally available, the kind of man modern women claim they want. What he doesn't yet understand is that he has begun participating in his own psychological disarmament. I work with men who describe this sensation with remarkable consistency. They speak of walking on eggshells they cannot see, of conversations that feel like negotiations where the terms constantly shift, of apologies that multiply like debts they never agreed to incur. One man told me he had started keeping mental notes of her moods, the way a sailor watches the sky for storms, not out of love, but out of survival. Another described deleting and rewriting a single text message 17 times, each version slightly softer, slightly more accommodating, until the original thought had been sanded down to nothing. These are not weak men. These are men who mistook anxiety for intimacy, who confused the adrenaline of instability with the intensity of genuine connection. The pattern reveals itself most clearly in a specific moment, when she creates an emotional crisis and he scrambles to restore equilibrium. She withdraws affection without explanation. She manufactures ambiguity about her feelings or her intentions. She presents him with emotional riddles that have no solution, only endless opportunities for him to prove his devotion through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of concern. And he does. He reaches out. He over-explains. He reassures. He sacrifices his boundaries, his time, his mission, his very nervous system to the task of stabilizing her emotional weather. What he experiences as love, she experiences as confirmation of leverage. What he believes is bringing them closer is, in fact, training him to remain in a state of perpetual anxiety and teaching her, at a level beneath conscious thought, that his presence has no consequence, no weight, no center of gravity that cannot be moved. The Stoics understood something about the architecture of the human soul that we have forgotten in our obsession with emotional expression. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the dirt and blood of military campaigns, in the administrative machinery of an empire that could collapse at any moment, recognized that a man's sovereignty begins and ends with his internal state, not his circumstances, not the behavior of others, not the approval or withdrawal of affection from those he desires. His internal state. The emperor wrote in his private meditations that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, that we are disturbed not by things, but by the opinions we form about them, that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. These were not poetic abstractions. They were survival instructions for maintaining psychological integrity in an environment designed to destroy it. Here's the thesis that governs everything that follows. A man who allows his emotional state to be determined by a woman's behavior has already surrendered the only form of power that actually matters in intimate dynamics, and she will punish him for this. Surrender even as she engineers the conditions that produce it. This is not cruelty. This is biology speaking through psychology, instinct expressing itself through interaction patterns that neither party fully understands. She does not consciously strategize to destabilize him, but an ancient, pre-verbal part of her psyche conducts a continuous test. Can this man's reality be bent? Can his frame be invaded? Can his nervous system be hijacked? And if the answer is yes, if he flinches and scrambles and rearranges himself to accommodate her emotional turbulence, then the exact mechanism that drove her to test him will quietly withdraw her respect, her desire, her genuine investment, even as her conscious mind cannot articulate why. The modern man faces a fierce version of this test because he has been systematically trained to fail it. From boyhood, he has absorbed 1,000 cultural messages insisting that emotional availability means emotional permeability, that being a good partner means making her feelings his responsibility, that love expresses itself through the sacrifice of boundaries. He has been told that the sensitive man, the emotionally intelligent man, the evolved man, is the one who centers her emotional experience, who does the work of managing her internal states, who demonstrates care through constant attention and validation. And so when he enters romantic dynamics, he brings this training with him. He monitors her moods, he adjusts his behavior to prevent her discomfort, he interprets her withdrawal as a problem he must solve, her coldness as a deficiency he must compensate for with greater warmth. He believes he is building intimacy. What he is actually doing is constructing the conditions of his own irrelevance. The mechanism operates with mechanical precision. She presents instability as sudden coldness, an ambiguous statement about her feelings, a manufactured crisis, a withdrawal of affection. His nervous system responds with anxiety. The anxiety drives him toward action designed to restore equilibrium. The placating text, the request for clarity, the offer to talk, the subtle shift in his behavior to prevent future disturbances. She registers this response at a level deeper than thought. The message received is not "he cares deeply," but rather "my emotional state governs his actions." And because feminine attraction, at its biological core, orients toward psychological strength, toward the man whose reality cannot be easily bent, whose frame remains stable under pressure, whose nervous system does not spike into anxiety when she pulls away, this confirmation of her power over his internal state begins the quiet erosion of her genuine desire. She may not recognize this consciously. She may even escalate the behavior, creating larger disturbances, bigger tests, more elaborate emotional puzzles driven by some unconscious hope that this time he will remain unmoved, that this time he will hold center while she spins. But each time he flinches, each time his stability depends on her stability, the attraction dies a little more. I once spoke to a man who described the final months of his relationship as a kind of psychological hostage situation. She would pick fights over nothing, create elaborate emotional dramas that required hours of discussion, threaten the relationship's future over perceived slights so minor he couldn't remember them the next day, and he would engage every single time. He would cancel work obligations to manage her crises. He would lie awake, replaying conversations, searching for the exact moment he had said the wrong thing. He would craft careful apologies for transgressions he didn't understand and didn't believe he had committed. He told himself this was what commitment looked like, that relationships required work, that her emotional intensity was proof of how much she cared. The relationship ended when she met someone else, a man who, by his own description, seemed less invested, less accommodating, less concerned with managing her emotional states. When I asked what he thought the difference was, he said something that revealed he was beginning to understand. "I don't think he was playing a game. I think he genuinely didn't need anything from her, so her pulling away didn't move him, and that immovability was the only thing I never gave her." This is the knife edge of the dynamic. Emotional stability is not a technique. It is not a performance of indifference designed to manipulate attraction. It is the genuine state of a man whose sense of self, whose mission, whose internal reality does not require her validation to remain coherent. The Stoics called this inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that external events cannot penetrate. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man's soul takes the color and shape of his thoughts, and that the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. What he meant, translated into the language of intimate dynamics, is this: if you allow the turbulence of another person's emotional state to determine your own, you have abandoned the only position from which genuine connection is even possible. You have dissolved your own center in the desperate attempt to stabilize hers, and in doing so have made yourself psychologically homeless, a man, living in the rented space of someone else's approval. The modern environment amplifies this pattern to pathological extremes. Dating apps present infinite options, creating an ambient instability where no connection ever feels final, where the potential for something better is always one swipe away. Social media transforms private dynamics into public performances, where emotional expression becomes currency and vulnerability becomes content. The attention economy rewards women for manufacturing drama, for performing instability, for creating the very turbulence that pulls anxious engagement from men who mistake their adrenaline response for genuine attraction. And the broader cultural messaging insists that masculine strength itself is toxic, that emotional needs are always legitimate. They must always be accommodated, that setting boundaries is a form of violence and maintaining frame is a form of control. Into this environment walks the man who has been taught that love means making her feelings his problem, and the system devours him. The cost is not merely one failed relationship or a series of painful dating experiences. The price is the slow hollowing out of the self. Each time he abandons his own reality to accommodate hers, each time he allows his nervous system to be hijacked by her emotional weather, each time he rearranges his life, his schedule, his mission, his internal state to restore her equilibrium, he is training himself into a pattern of self-abandonment. His sense of self becomes contingent rather than foundational. His confidence becomes borrowed rather than owned. He begins to experience his own life as something that happens to him rather than something he authors, because he has outsourced the most fundamental element of authorship, the governance of his own internal state. The man who cannot sit calmly in the face of her withdrawal, who cannot maintain his center when she creates chaos, who cannot hold frame when she tests his boundaries, is not simply failing one interaction. He is participating in the systematic destruction of his own psychological sovereignty. This is where the Stoic framework becomes not philosophy, but survival technology. The Stoics were not arguing for emotional suppression or the denial of feeling. They were arguing for a radical restructuring of causality, a refusal to grant external events, including the behavior of others, the power to determine internal state. Epictetus, who knew slavery and freedom in their most literal forms, taught that we suffer not from events, still, from our judgments about events, that some things are within our control and others are not, and that peace comes from learning to locate our concern exclusively in the former category. A woman's behavior, her moods, her tests, her withdrawals, her emotional turbulence, these are external events. They are not within your control. What is within your control is your response, your interpretation, the stability or instability of your own nervous system in the face of her instability. And the moment you truly internalize this distinction, the moment it moves from intellectual understanding to lived reality, the entire dynamic transforms. The woman who creates an emotional crisis and encounters instead of anxious scrambling, a calm man who remains centered, who neither ignores her nor collapses himself to accommodate her experiences, something rare enough in modern dynamics to be almost shocking. She experiences the presence of an immovable frame, not rigid, not cold, not punishing, but also not penetrable. The man who can say, without anger or defensiveness, "I can see you're upset, and I'm here if you want to talk about it, but I'm not going to participate in manufacturing problems when none exist." This man is speaking a language most women rarely encounter. He is setting a boundary that protects both of them, her from the consequences of unchecked emotional turbulence, and him from the destruction of his own center. And the paradox, the part that most men find impossible to believe until they experience it directly, is that this refusal to be moved often produces more genuine attraction, more authentic respect, more stable intimacy than any amount of anxious accommodation ever could. But this is not a strategy to get something from her. That distinction is crucial. If the emotional stability is performed, if it is a technique deployed to manipulate her back into desire, if beneath the calm surface is the same anxious grasping, the same need for her validation, the same dependence on her response, she will sense it. Women possess an almost preternatural ability to detect inauthenticity in precisely this domain because their biological survival has historically depended on accurately assessing male strength under pressure. The stability must be absolute. It must come from a genuine reorientation of what matters, a fundamental shift in where he locates his sense of self, his mission, his purpose, the architecture of his daily life, his relationship with himself. These must be sufficiently robust that her emotional weather, while noted, does not govern. He cares about her, but he does not need her approval to know who he is. He desires her, but he does not require her desire to maintain his own internal stability. He is willing to lose her, rather than lose himself in the attempt to keep her. And that willingness, that genuine comfort with potential loss, is the only foundation from which a relationship of equals becomes possible. Consider the alternative trajectory. The man who does not develop this capacity, who continues to allow his emotional state to be determined by her behavior, who treats every withdrawal as an emergency and every test as a problem requiring immediate resolution. Where does he end up? Not in 5 minutes, but in 5 years. He has trained himself into a state of chronic anxiety. His nervous system is constantly in a low-level state of activation, scanning for threats, monitoring her mood, and preparing for the next crisis. He has structured his life around her emotional management, which means he has no life, no center, no mission substantial enough to provide ballast when she inevitably tests him again. He has become the kind of man who apologizes for things he didn't do, who explains himself to justify basic boundaries, who feels guilty for having needs or preferences that inconvenience her. His relationships, if they continue at all, become stale and sexless, characterized not by passion, but by a kind of exhausted maintenance. And the women he attracts or keeps are precisely the women who require an anxious partner, who need his instability to manage their own, who have learned that love means someone whose life they can dominate. He has become, in the language of the Stoics, an enslaved person, not literally but psychologically. His chains are invisible but real, forged from his own dependence on external validation, his inability to sit with discomfort, his refusal to locate his center anywhere she cannot reach. Now consider the other path. The man who takes this not as theory, but as initiation, as a fundamental restructuring of how he relates to his own nervous system, his own sense of self, his own capacity to remain stable in the face of instability. He begins small. He notices the moment anxiety spikes when she doesn't respond to a text, and instead of sending another message, he sits with the discomfort. He observes it. He breathes through it. He lets it exist without acting to discharge it. He notices when her mood shifts, and his first impulse is to fix it. Instead of immediately moving to restore her equilibrium, he pauses. He reminds himself that her feelings are hers, that his responsibility is not to manage her internal state, but to maintain his own. He begins to prioritize his mission, whatever that is, his work, his training, his craft, his purpose, not as a rejection of relationship, but as the foundation that makes genuine relationship possible. He becomes a man whose day, whose week, whose life has structure and meaning independent of her presence or absence. This is difficult. It goes against every social conditioning, every cultural message, every instinct that screams at him to do something when she pulls away. It requires him to tolerate what feels, in the moment, like risk. The risk that if he doesn't respond immediately, she'll lose interest. The risk that, if he doesn't accommodate her emotional turbulence, she'll leave. The risk that, if he maintains his boundaries, he'll end up alone. These fears are real. Sometimes she will go. Sometimes the relationship will end. But here is what the Stoics understood, and what modern men must relearn. A relationship that requires your self-abandonment is not one worth keeping. A woman who cannot respect a man with boundaries is not capable of genuine intimacy, and the loneliness of being alone is vastly preferable to the loneliness of being with someone while having disappeared from your own life. Over time, something shifts. The man who develops genuine emotional stability, not as performance, but as lived reality, begins to move through the world differently. His relationships become clearer. The women who require anxiety, who feed on instability, who cannot tolerate a man they cannot move, these women filter themselves out quickly, often with drama, often with accusations that he is cold or unavailable or emotionally distant, and he learns to let them go without chasing, without defending himself, without leading them to understand. Other women, rarer but infinitely more valuable, respond differently. They relax in his presence. They stop testing because they found something stable enough that testing is no longer necessary. They bring their own center to meet his, and the relationship that emerges is not a merger of dependencies, but a collaboration of sovereignties. The professional sphere shifts as well. The man who is no longer spending his emotional energy managing other people's reactions, who is no longer buffeted by the approval or disapproval of those around him, who has learned to maintain internal stability regardless of external chaos. This man becomes dangerous in the best possible way. His work improves because his attention is no longer fractured. His decision-making sharpens because it's no longer contaminated by the need to avoid conflict or secure validation. His presence carries weight because it is no longer contingent, no longer borrowed, no longer requiring constant external confirmation to remain coherent. But the most profound transformation is internal. The man who reclaims governance of his own nervous system, who refuses to outsource his emotional state to anyone else, who builds his life on the foundation of his own mission rather than her approval, this man begins to experience something most modern men have never known: genuine self-respect. Not the fragile, defensive variety that requires constant reinforcement and collapses at the first challenge, but the quiet, immovable kind that comes from knowing he can trust himself. He can trust that when pressure arrives, he will not collapse. He can trust that when she tests him, he will hold center. He can trust that when the relationship ends, and every relationship either ends or transforms, he will not lose himself in the wreckage because he never abandoned himself in the first place. The Stoic emperor, writing by candlelight in a military tent, surrounded by advisors who wanted things from him, managing an empire that would outlast him and forget him, understood what we are only beginning to relearn: that the entire architecture of a well-lived life rests on the foundation of a well-governed internal state. That everything else, wealth, status, relationships, pleasure, success, is either built on this foundation or it is built on sand. That the man who cannot govern himself, who allows his reality to be determined by external forces he cannot control, is not free in any meaningful sense, regardless of his circumstances. Another path to freedom, the only path, is the systematic development of internal sovereignty, the capacity to remain stable, centered, unmoved by the chaos that surrounds and tests and attempts to penetrate. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about rejecting emotion, denying care, or transforming yourself into some caricature of masculine stoicism. It is about recognizing a fundamental truth that will either liberate you or continue to destroy you. You cannot control her behavior, her moods, her tests, her emotional weather. You can only control your response. And the quality of your entire life, the depth of your relationships, the substance of your work, the coherence of your mission, the stability of your peace depends on taking that control seriously, depends on learning, through repeated practice, through 1,000 small decisions, to sit with discomfort rather than act to discharge it, to maintain your frame rather than collapse into hers, to prioritize your mission rather than sacrifice it for temporary approval, to build your life on the foundation of your own center rather than the shifting ground of someone else's validation. If you ignore this, if you continue to believe that love means making her feelings your responsibility, that care means allowing her emotional state to govern yours, that being a good man means abandoning your boundaries to accommodate her tests, you will continue the pattern. The anxiety will deepen. The relationships will repeat the same arc, intensity, instability, increasing accommodation on your part, decreasing respect on hers, the slow erosion of attraction, and the eventual end. You will find yourself, in 5 years, in 10 years, more bitter, more confused, more resentful, wondering why the same thing keeps happening to different women, never recognizing that the constant factor is not their behavior, but your response to it. You will have become the kind of man who lives in a perpetual state of low-level emergency, whose life is structured around the management of other people's emotional weather, who has forgotten or never learned what it feels like to be at home in his own skin. The women in your life will sense this homelessness and, without consciously meaning to, will punish you for it, because instinct cannot respect what it can easily move. If you answer this instead, if you treat it as the initiation it is meant to be, the call to reclaim governance of your own internal state, to build a life whose center cannot be invaded, to develop the capacity to remain stable while everything around you attempts to destabilize you, the path is more challenging, but it leads somewhere real. You will spend time alone, more than you're comfortable with at first. You will lose relationships that were never actually serving you. You will face moments of doubt, where every instinct screams at you to go back to the old pattern, to reach out, to apologize, to accommodate, to sacrifice your center one more time, and you will have to choose again and again to remain still. Let her react while you hold the frame. To prioritize your mission while she tests whether you can be moved. To tolerate the discomfort of potential loss rather than pay the price of certain self-abandonment. But the man who makes these choices, who develops this capacity, who builds his life on the foundation of emotional sovereignty, this man becomes free in a way that most people no longer believe is possible, free from the tyranny of other people's reactions, free from the desperate need for external validation, free to build relationships based on genuine desire rather than anxious dependence, free to pursue a mission that matters, with or without anyone's approval, free to walk through the world with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing with absolute certainty that whatever happens, he will not lose himself. She does not steal your stability, she reveals the absence of it. If this hit something in you, if it named a pattern you've been living but couldn't articulate, then share it with the men in your life who need to hear it. Subscribe to keep this work alive for those still searching, and understand that the path forward begins with a single recognition that the only person responsible for your emotional state is you, and the moment you truly accept that responsibility is the moment everything begins to change. You cannot control the chaos. You can only refuse to let it govern you.